Welcome back to yet another episode of your Really Educated podcast. We are approaching the end of season 10 and we have a very special guest today, Talbot Brewer. He is a professor of philosophy at the University of Virginia, widely recognized for his contributions to moral philosophy, political theory, and moral psychology. At the core of his thought lies a powerful commitment to the concept of dialectical activity, a kind of meaningful human engagement that is pursued not as a means to an end, but as an end in itself. His work offers a compelling critique of modern moral philosophy's tendency to reduce ethics to decision making and utility, reviving a richer, more Aristotelian version of what it means to lead a good life. I'm really excited for today's conversation. How are you doing?
Well, I'm doing well. Thank you for having me on your podcast, Gotham. I really appreciate it and looking forward to our chat.
Yeah, I mean, this idea of dialectical activity is something that I never knew that that's what it was called, but that concept changed my life, especially in relation to learning. And I am so excited to get into it. But before we start, I want to learn a little bit more about you, and I'm curious how you found yourself to summarize the last few decades of your life in a few minutes. But how did you find yourself in academia? How did you find yourself fascinated by philosophy? What led you here?
Oh my gosh, that's such well, I mean, there are long and short versions of the story, but a pivotal moment, weirdly enough, happened when I was working for an academic publisher right after I'd finished up my undergraduate years. And I didn't like that work very much. It was kind of mind-numbing, and I was on the edge of academia, but doing really sort of uninteresting, things. And I went out for lunch one day, and the wind was blowing. It was on the Upper West Side of New York. The wind was blowing up Broadway, and there was a young lady who had a bunch of empty boxes crossing the street, crossing Broadway, and the wind caught the boxes and kind of scattered them around. And I helped her collect them, and we got to the other side, and I asked her what these boxes were for. She said that she worked for an estate settlement company and was going to be discarding a bunch of books that didn't sell at the estate sale. And I said, well, could I look at them before you throw them away? And she agreed. So we went to, it turned out to be the apartment of a recently deceased Columbia University professor. It was chock full of philosophy books. And I was already a lover of philosophy, but then I began to read this wonderful inherited library of philosophy books. And, my enthusiasm and interest just got deeper and deeper. And so I'm here because the wind was blowing on the Upper West Side one day many years ago. That's the answer.
I mean, what are the chances? I mean, I feel like it's like something that comes out of a movie where you're just like, you just look across the train and you meet somebody and then all of a sudden your whole life changes. I mean, I think those type of stories are often so beautiful because it really shows how unpredictable all of this is. And you kind of
Yeah,
just let yourself
the
open
fun
and
in your
then,
way is it's you never know what will change your life. You really don't. But
yeah.
that's my story.
I always like learning. It's like a small, intimate detail, but I always like learning about people's bookshelves because I think you can learn so much about what's on it. What's one of the books behind you that you feel like has stayed with you for a very long time?
Oh my gosh. This is just a handful of books that I've let's have well, here this is one that I have been thinking about. Yeah, quite a lot recently. The Plato's Timaeus, his creation story. And I've been writing about it. I don't know, maybe it's not one that has stayed with me a long time. The Plato that I ran into early in my graduate career uh, was, well, the usual suspects, the Republic, the Gorgias, and then I worked my way to the Phaedrus and the Symposium, and those blew me away. They came into, I mean, I began to think about them at just the right time, and they intersected with some of the work that you mentioned early on, the interest in dialectical activity, and just captivated me. So I began to write about Platonic eros as another way of thinking about some of the things I had been already gripped by when it comes to thinking about human life and human activity. And so those books have really stayed with me for years. And the creation story, I think, has always, of Plato's, has always been exiled from Western philosophy because it just looks a little too damn religious, and that Western philosophy really does, stake itself to a self-image as something that's quite different from theology. That divorce happened hundreds of years ago, and that divorce is really, central to the field's understanding of what it's about. And so I had to kind of leap the tracks and look at the Timaeus myself, but that too was a formative moment. And I suppose, though, that the work that has marked me over the years, maybe more than any other work, it doesn't happen to be on this bookshelf, but I've got plenty of copies kicking around at home in my other office, is Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics. Yeah, you mentioned that I'm, some people do think of me as an Aristotelian, and, there's something right about that. And definitely that work was, that work has been and remains extremely important to me.
Mm. If you could just kind of briefly summarize what Aristotelian ethics, kind of what is the essence of it?
Oh, yeah, yeah. Well, I early on in my career as a professor, I had been at Harvard University for my graduate studies, and that's a very Kantian department. So I really knew my way around, broadly Kantian ways of thinking about ethics. And, I think Aristotelianism wasn't a prominent view at Harvard at the time that I was there. I mean, it wasn't ignored, but I think, in looking back, I think that it didn't really come into focus for me in my graduate years, and there are ways of teaching it, I think, that really do leave it out of focus. There's a picture of what it is to teach the history of philosophical ethics that basically says, hey, we've got one subject matter here, and people who've looked at this subject matter in different ways, and here's the Aristotelian take on the subject matter called morality or ethics, and here's the Kantian take and Mill's take, and so on and so forth. I think that's the wrong way to understand the connection, or almost I want to say disconnection, among these folks. The subject matter shifts over time. And so really to go back to Aristotelianism is to experiment with the pros and cons of a recasting of the central questions in this moving target that we call ethics, right? It is a history of an evolving conversation that has shifted its emphasis and its focus over time. And so really to return to Aristotelianism, as I think about it, and not everybody thinks about it this way, is to refocus your normative attention on a much more sweeping conception of what it is to live well as a human being, rather than to focus more narrowly on something like, our obligations, those demands, a failure to, fulfill which appropriately occasions blame, right? That blame-centric conception of what the field of morality is doesn't fit well when you look back at Aristotle. I mean, Aristotle covers a whole bunch of, arete, excellences. That gets translated as virtues, but that can make it seem a little prim and Victorian. This is really about, the character traits that you need in order to, in the fullest sense, to live a good life. And he does list in this array of character traits things that we would, run together with and take to be part of the subject matter of, moral theory, where they're focused on moral obligation. He thinks about honesty. He thinks about justice. Sounds continuous. But then you're turning the pages and looking at these arete, and all of a sudden you get to one called wit, And we don't tend to think, and I think we're right not to think, that a failure to be witty is an occasion for blame. Well, given that it's not, that must mean that he's just thinking about a different field of normative phenomena, and he sees them as a unity. And so, to become an Aristotelian, it seems to me, is to begin to see as a unity a sweeping set of normative aspirations, one part of which is what we call morality, and then to see morality as given its sense by its place in that wider field of proper human aspirations. And
Mm.
so I don't know
It's not
that,
like the end.
it's
Where would you kind of contrast the Kantian way, prioritizing living ethically, or ethics being like that being the end in itself, where that, aiming for that is the entirety of what a good life is?
you mean in the Kantian or the
Yeah,
Aristotelian?
in the Kantian.
Well, no, the Kantian sort of divides the field of normativity into the pursuit of the good and the observance of the limitations imposed by the right. And so you don't get that division in Aristotle. And then morality is the inquiry into those limitations that we call demands of the right. But pursuing your own good, that's another matter. It's limited by the right. Whereas for the Aristotelian, the pursuit of what we would call the right, or the observance of what we would call interpersonal obligations, is woven into a sweeping conception of your good. And
Mm.
it doesn't limit your good, it expresses your good properly understood. And so it really is a change in the understanding of the subject of inquiry and the breadth of the subject of inquiry that's at issue here. And the ancients, Plato and Aristotle both, have a much broader conception of the proper subject of inquiry. And they think that if you zoom in on this narrow thing that we would call the right or the field of obligation, you're not going to understand it in isolation. You have to understand it as part of this wider, proper human calling, I guess is maybe the way to put it. So, yeah, that's how I would understand the difference between Kant and Aristotle. And it makes it very hard. I mean, now when I teach the history of Western ethics, I really try to emphasize for my students that, this is not a set of theoretical takes on an unchanging set of questions, an unchanging subject matter. The questions are shifting under your feet as you move through time.
It is so cool to me that people 2,300 years ago were, it just, it's so beautiful how connected we are to all of humans, particularly through a lot of these disciplines, whether it's philosophy, mathematics, I mean, all science, I mean, all the sciences. And it's just, every time I hear these names, there's like a sense of awe and wonder that just like arises from within, which is just like, it's so cool that we get to now in 2025 talk about someone who lived in the 300 BCs, you know what I mean?
Yeah,
And
it
it's
really
and
is. Yeah.
still draw on the ideas. They're not archaic ideas, and still draw on some of them, and use that as a building block for further inquiry. So one thing that I'm really curious and excited to talk about is dialectical activity. So I'll just give a little bit of background so we can kind of connect this all together. But I grew up in the Bay Area, where education has become purely like this training exercise. You learn so then you can go to college so that you can get a job. And there's no real question why. If you ask why, you're a heretic. You're not supposed to ask why. Obviously, you're supposed to want a good job. Duh. And so the question of why am I doing what I'm doing is not something that's really asked. But it was only when I got to UC San Diego I met a lot of mathematicians and a lot of the professors who truly loved the art of mathematics for the sake of it, for the aesthetics of it, for the beauty of it, for all of that. That was the reason why they pursued math. It wasn't for an end. Everything else just came as a byproduct in some ways. And that completely changed my relationship with knowledge in general, because I didn't even know that was possible until I was 20. And I was like, I had no idea. And so I want to first expand, maybe allow you to maybe explain a little bit more on what dialectical activity is, and then I'm really excited to then connect that to learning.
Yeah, those are all great questions, and thank you for that interesting and personal prelude. I resonate with a lot of those thoughts. Yeah, so um, very brief overview of one prominent strand of thought in contemporary philosophical understandings of action, what we call action theory. One very prominent action theory that still has a lot of proponents was put forward by the late great Anglo-American philosopher Donald Davidson. According to that theory, the source of any action is a desire, and a desire, there's some desire behind every human action that sort of gives it its oomph, that gives rise to it, and gives it its point, its directionality. And the desire is an orientation towards some state of affairs that does not yet obtain, that you're trying to bring into view. So, all action is sort of world remaking. It's always oriented toward, the good the picture of the good that inclines you to act is a goodness that you see in some state of affairs that doesn't yet obtain. And all action is production. It's oriented toward the bringing about of those states of affairs. So, I don't think that that's the right way to think about action, and I don't think that it captures what I call dialectical activity. And that's my phrase for it. I've come to see the close connections that obtain between what Aristotle called energeia or activity and what I was at that time in my career calling dialectical activity as I've gone forward over the years. I mean, but he thinks that, human actions fall into two categories. There are kineses, which are oriented toward bringing things about. And in a way, I think Davidson, takes all action to be what Aristotle would call kinesis. But there's also this thing called energeia, which is its own point. You don't do it in order to bring about anything. You do it because of its beauty. And as you're doing it, what you're drawn to and what pulls you forward is a vision of the unfolding activity. But that vision sort of sweeps in the past of the activity, the present of the activity, and, orients you toward a possible future unfolding of the activity. The activity itself, in the moment in which you are engaged in it, is captivating you and is what you are gripped by. So if we're going to speak of desire here, the desire sweeps across the past, present, and future and brings you into the activity in such a way as to make the activity itself wholehearted. And you can think about, the Davidsonian kinesis-based idea of action as exhaustively production. You could think that it always postpones that which is of value. So whenever you're acting, you're not yet there at the thing of value. And so it's sort of a recipe for the permanent postponement of the good stuff in life, right? Whereas, Aristotle wants to say, no, the good of human life is activity. It's not some state that we're trying to bring about, some passive state. It is being fully engaged in living that is where the action is, what life is all about. And so you need to have a category of human activities that are their own end. And he thinks of, the central stuff of friendship, the central stuff of philosophy, the kind of conversation we're having right now. We're not having this it may have beneficial results or, disastrous. Who knows what kind of results it will have. But I'm drawn into it because the evolving ideas that I hear from you and that I'm trying to express have a grip on me. And, and this is, I think, what you're talking about when you report what you observed in the way that your math professors were gripped by what they loved, right?
Yeah.
It wasn't something beyond that activity, the activity of
Yeah.
mathematical reflection that they were aimed at.
Yes.
It was that, right?
Yes. And
No,
I am so fascinated by this thing because I see it in you can do it with anything. You could do it with washing dishes, you could do it with making sandwiches, you can do it with driving, you can also do it with quantum physics. You can with dancing, when you get lost, maybe some psychologists would call it flow state, maybe everyone has like a different word for it, but that sense of it's really interesting because I bring up this feeling a lot with parents. So I teach a lot, and one of my main intentions is like separating from the schooling aspect of learning and losing yourself purely in this kind of uh, what did you call it? Energeia? Energeia?
yeah, that's right. Yes.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I mean, losing yourself in that aspect of learning where you truly commit to just like understanding yourself, the world, whatever it is for the sake of itself. But the first response I usually hear, which has been really interesting to me, is, but at the end of the day, my kids have to be realistic. They gotta, I hear this from a lot of parents. My kids got to be realistic. My kids got to get into college. My kids, it's there's this belief that doing things with this perspective somehow doesn't actually allow you to do whatever it is you're trying to do at the highest level. I wonder, do you have any hypotheses why that may be, where there's actually some sort of like, this is all woo woo, like it's not possible to be in this state more often than not?
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, you mentioned, ordinary garden variety daily activities that can be performed in something like this state. And, I think that that's right. If you contextualize that what you're doing when you're engaged in family life and doing the part of it that, involves washing the dishes in that wider context and see the value of the whole and the contribution of the part to the whole, then you can see the intrinsic value of that which you're up to in that moment and be wrapped up in it in that way. And then it becomes something that is intrinsically rewarding. And I think that conversion in your understanding of almost anything is possible. But there are some activities, and this is what I had in mind when I reached for the word dialectical. There are some activities that have the following structure. The full understanding of what it is to excel in them or to engage properly in them is something that unveils itself to you gradually in a kind of movement back and forth between moments of throwing yourself into it and moments of seeing by throwing yourself into it what's there to be savored in it, right? And that back and forth, that learning process that's internal to the activity is what I had in mind when I spoke of a dialectic, right? So, those are sort of indefinitely fathomable activities whose point is always something that can be revealed more fully to you. And I guess I think of loving relationships as like that. I think of, the higher callings that, we have in mind when we speak of, culture as like that. I certainly think of my own activity, philosophy, as like that. It is always, capable of revealing further to any of its practitioners,
Mm,
any of the people who love it, something that they have not yet seen that is part of what makes it a worthy human calling, right? And
yeah.
and this is something that you have to be seeing and seeing repeatedly and exposing, permitting yourself to be shaped by in order to become good at such an activity. There are lots of such activities that can be financially rewarding, and there's no way to become good at them except by throwing yourself into them in this spirit. But of course, there's the financial rewards can't be what you have foremost in mind, otherwise you're not engaged in them in the spirit that will permit them to unveil their full
Mm,
potentiality, right? So I don't know,
true.
there's so much
Yeah.
economic anxiety right now that makes good sense to me among undergraduates and their parents and so forth. And I can well understand where the folks you have just sort of mentioned, where they're coming from. But I guess I would say that there's just no way to become good at the most interesting and often most rewarding things that you can do with your life, except by permitting their beauty to make itself evident to you in an experiential way.
Mm,
And quite apart from what we might hope to do in our careers, there's also this thing called living a full human life. And that undeniably requires this, you know, permission to abandon yourself to and permit yourself to be gripped by activities that are
yeah.
their own reward.
I think really beautifully said. I think one of the challenges happens because I think living a beautiful life often is very internal. I'm not sure how clear it is from the outside that someone's leading a beautiful life when they are gripped by these things, right? Unless you really see them talk about it, see them in action. This is something I feel a lot with playing chess specifically, where when I play chess, I like lose myself in those 20, 30 minutes by just the beauty of it. The past becomes the present, the future becomes, you just kind of get lost in the world of strategy and thinking and the aesthetics of it. And I think one of the really hard things though is it feels in some ways so much of the American society focuses on the external. So how do I show others that I am doing well? How do I show you that I'm happy? How do I show you that I like my job or I have a great life? Rather than how do I genuinely lead a good life to where I get to know that I'm leading a good life, right? Do you feel like that particular shift has always been like has it always been so external driven, or do you feel like it oscillates era to era and time period to time period? Because I'm assuming the more you focus internally on what does it mean to lead a good life, am I leading a good life, you're more likely to be engaged in these type of dialectical activities.
Well, these activities are typically quite shareable, and and maybe that they don't even come into their own fully unless and until they're shared. I mean, thinking and writing are joined at the hip. Thinking and conversation are joined at the hip. One of the things that is one of the best ways to see more clearly. Um, the what's good about literature, what's good about philosophy, what's good about mathematics is to come into sustained conversation with others who are just opening themselves to those activities, or maybe are way down the road with those activities. And so these seem to me to be very communal kinds of I mean, I almost want to call them interactivities, right? And this was definitely Aristotle's view of these matters and Plato's view of these matters. I mean, Plato, was a student of Socrates who, wandered the streets of Athens and engaged people and, continuously in conversation. That was his métier. And, these are open-ended activities, partly in the sense that they are perpetually and properly open to all comers. I don't, I guess,
Mm.
yeah, I understand that there are private moments in such activities, but they don't come fully into their own without the public moments. Uh, Again, writing,
Mm.
conversation, teaching, all those sorts of things.
Mm. The highest form, I guess, huh? I guess maybe this personally, I guess, is how I've had to build my own life, just because I feel like a lot of the things that I'm fascinated by, philosophy and these type of things, are things that I don't have the spaces to openly talk about because a lot of the
Uh,
people in my life find it to be unnecessary or not useful or whatever. And so I've learned to kind of internalize these fascinations. And so it I can't imagine what it's like to be in environments where everyone kind of has their own little thing that they're mesmerized by, and then there's like a community where everyone shares ideas and bounces it off. I feel like that's like the creative's dream in some way. Do you feel
uh,
like your experience in the university has kind of been that?
Well, I mean, like any large institution, contemporary universities have their warts and their pathologies, really, and some of those pathologies are um, caused by the embedding of these institutions in wider socioeconomic structures that are very production oriented. And so I can't say that, that there's a perfect uh, community of, practice of the humanities in the purest form, probably anywhere in the world, and certainly not at my university. But to some extent, yeah, I feel like it's here, and you need the institution to embody it, and then also that that need creates the continual possibility of disfigurement. but yeah, I feel very fortunate to be part of it. But then, apart from the contemporaneous community, there is the cross-temporal community that you were talking about just a moment ago. When you open the works of people who were writing, 2.5 millennia ago, and feel yourself to be moved by them, you are coming into a kind of a community with them, and that's and this it's a human project. The humanities quite generally, the arts and also the sciences quite generally, these are cross-generational human projects. And when you throw yourself into them, you are making yourself part of a conversation that was going long before you started listening to it. And with a little luck, will go on long after you're gone, you know. And this was front and center, and it's not just that this happens with the works of those thinkers you were mentioning a few moments ago. They were intending it to happen. They were hoping it would happen. They were dramatizing its potentiality. The symposium begins with somebody who is retelling the he's reproducing word by word a conversation that he was told about by somebody who was there. And in that conversation, one of the main speakers, Socrates, is retelling a conversation that he had when he was a very young man. So you have sort of three generations of inheritance of, reports of conversations. That's the frame, that's the narrative frame that the dialogue begins with. And that is I think that's Plato's way of saying, this is the sort of thing that should be passed on generation to generation. And I'm writing it down in hopes that it will be, right? That's uh,
Mm,
that's what I just think that's what the humanities are. They're not an isolated individual undertaking. They're a human
yeah.
undertaking.
Mm. I want to expand a little bit on this because I want to touch on morality and your thoughts on how the humanities influence morality. But before I get to that, I wonder, what do you think is the essence of the humanities? Because I think, in my
Yeah.
opinion, I find there to be a component of humanities in everything. But then I still haven't fleshed that idea out fully. But it doesn't. I don't know why chemistry or biology needs to be separate from the humanities. I just feel like
Hmm.
my personal belief, for some reason, is that no matter what you study, it undertakes a certain belief. There's like a hidden layer of views and beliefs that particular frame of thinking brings with it. So growing up in the Bay, I was around a lot of technologists. And so that wasn't just like a profession, it was an entire way of understanding the world, how they define progress, what they think is human flourishing, why they think humans are alive. I mean, them
Hmm.
being in that space really dictated that. Versus when I'm in DC and I'm around a lot of policymakers, that's not just a profession again, right? I mean, the way they think about what ought a human to do, what society for, are all deeply influenced by the things that they have studied and worked. So in that ways, I don't really know what the separation between the humanities and the hard sciences are. And so I'm just curious, before we talk about the humanities, what are the humanities? What does that mean?
Yeah, yeah. Well, we have different terms that we make use of in order to sort of, I don't know, just to bring into view what we're up to in different parts of the university. There's the phrase liberal arts, and there's the idea of a liberal education. And the liberal arts do sweep in the sciences and what we call the humanities, and they pick out a commonality that is really important and that I think you were gesturing at a moment ago, right? So I don't think of the sciences as part of the humanities, and I'll get to that in a moment, but they are part of the liberal arts. Historically, that phrase liberal arts was, what's liberal doing in that phrase? Well, it is a way of categorizing these pursuits of the mind as things that it makes sense to do with your liberty, your freedom from necessity, right? And so, in that sense, the sciences, there might be little pockets of scientific inquiry, especially technological orientations within that field that are addressed to the question of human need and the satisfaction of human need. But there's a great deal of what happens under the heading of science that is only at best tangentially related to the fulfillment of basic human needs. And that if it answers to any human need at all, it's the human need to understand, to make sense of the world around us. And that, that's what the liberal arts are about. They're about understanding for its own sake, right? Aristotle begins the metaphysics by saying that humans by nature desire to understand. They want to make sense of this crazy thing called human life and this crazy thing called the cosmos or the universe in which we find ourselves. And that's what the liberal arts are about. If you've got a little freedom from necessity, a little elbow room to, expend on things that are intrinsically valuable, mental pursuits that are intrinsically valuable, the liberal arts are where you want to turn, right? That's what it makes sense to do with that freedom. But the humanities within the liberal arts, I think they're widely misunderstood. When I wrote an essay about this a few years ago, and I thought it might make sense to see what Wikipedia says about what the humanities are, and they say that those are the humanities is that set of disciplines of the contemporary academy, that set of academic disciplines that focus on or that try to understand human culture. That makes it sound like what you're doing in the humanities is there's an object of study, and you're trying to bring it into view in the way that maybe you're trying to bring plants into view when you're doing botany, or chemical reactions into view when you do chemistry. Then you turn to human culture, you try to bring it into view. I think that misses an important dimension of what's up in the humanities. I mean, first of all, the humanities include a lot of things that don't involve that kind of, a quest for understanding of anything like that sort. There's theater, there's acting, there's playwriting, there's the writing of poetry, there is philosophizing. And here we're not just sort of studying human culture, we're engaging in thought, right? We're being gripped by and carrying forward human culture, right? Or at least a strand of it, right? That's very different posture toward it from the posture that's suggested by that Wikipedia entry that says that this is the study of this thing. It's not arm's length in that way. It's immersion in an activity. And now if you ask, well, what activity is that? And why does it deserve the name humanities? What does the human have to do with it? In a way, the human being is this very interesting sort of thing that, cannot turn its attention to itself without changing that which it is thinking about, right? And that makes all the difference. We don't change plants when we do botany, right? They hold steady and we study them. But when we turn our attention to ourselves, all things go dialectical. The activity that we're engaged in keeps moving and being reshaped underneath our attentive gaze. And now what we have is something like change and, when it goes well, growth, right? The movement toward greater depth. We're in motion, we're in play. And that's, I think, what is crucial about the humanities, right? Is that they put us in play. They call us into question. They alter us as we engage in them in a way that is quite different from, it seems to me, the way we're altered, though also we are, by something like the study of botany, right? Yeah.
Question.
Yeah, go ahead.
So let's say you're studying the human body, for example, and you understand what an atom is, and then all of a sudden that changes your perception of maybe who you are. Or let's say you're studying consciousness and you reach a point. So then in that same way of labeling humanities, I thought that was a beautiful definition, by the way, but just the engaging of something that has the capacity to alter the viewer as they engage in it. Can't the sciences also fall under that?
To some degree, yes. And, I mean, it's interesting. Philosophy, in my field, is central or a central part of the humanities. Um, and if you arrive at a terminal degree in any part of the liberal arts, um, that degree will be called a doctor of philosophy. And that's because if you roll back the reel about 400 years and look at, European institutions of higher learning, there was only one doctoral degree that was available, and that was the doctoral degree of philosophy. And so, and this was decidedly a humanities degree. And the breadth of that old idea of philosophy is still present in the new practice of philosophy. There is a philosophical way of engaging with physics. There's something called philosophy of physics. And it doesn't happen only in philosophy departments. Thought can go philosophical within physics departments and often does. And, many of us love the writings of those physicists who permit themselves to begin reflecting on the place of the human being in Earth as revealed by the cutting edge of physics and so forth. That is allied to, it is joined at the hip with the kind of reflection that we find within the humanities. And I suppose that similar points could be made about almost any part of the university, and those points would be seconded by, and you could pursue them further, develop, articulate them further by thinking about those portions of the current study of philosophy that we call philosophy of mathematics, philosophy of
Mm,
politics, philosophy of law, philosophy of science, philosophy of physics, so on and so forth. There's a philosophy of psychology. There's a part of philosophy that corresponds to every bit of the contemporary and liberal arts. And that, I think, is a way of sort of, recognizing the force of the point that you're making, which is that, any study of anything worth studying has a philosophical dimension and can yield deeper insights into, the cosmos and our place in it in a way that permits us to, you know, um, that changes us, right? And
mm.
deepens us. Yeah, I agree with you.
I want to just get your personal take because this has been something that's been happening a lot very recently. And I don't know, it's been taking a part of my spirit away, and I'm trying to learn how to combat it. But I I think the way you just defined philosophy is what makes me so fascinated about it. It was through finding my love for philosophy that I ended up finding my interest in everything. I feel like I was sleepwalking most of my life. And then I came into contact with philosophy, and then all of a sudden, the whole world became beautiful. And I just felt like I woke up. But the
Mm-hmm.
more I speak about it, a lot of people, I think, keep bringing up that I have kids to raise. I don't have time to think like this. I have this to do. I don't have time to think like this. Like I don't have, you're so lucky to be able to have all your needs met so you can just sit here thinking about the world, and I've been hearing that a lot, which has been making me feel like why do all these people make me feel like I'm just wasting my time for thinking deeply about things? Like, am I doing something wrong? I'm I don't know. I guess I haven't done it enough to be able to clearly define why I strongly feel like philosophy isn't a waste of time. But I hear it so often that I don't know what to say. Because so many people would just be like, well, I raised my kids and they're fine and I'm able to provide for my family and my parents and this and that. And I don't think about any of these things. So why, why should I? And
Yeah.
I guess, and this ties us back into the morality question in some ways, but I'm curious, in in that framework, why is philosophy important?
Yeah, yeah. Why is philosophy important? Well, I would suspect that the people who are saying such things to you, in fact, are wrestling with philosophical questions and don't describe them in that way. That would be my surmise. I think of philosophy as the intensification and further articulation and refinement of inescapable life problems. And I don't, I mean, you can't raise kids,
Yeah,
it seems to me, without grappling with the question of the nature and point of a well-lived human life, right? I mean, in a way,
for
the
sure.
whole,
Not possible.
yeah, your objective as a loving parent, inescapably, right? This is what I mean when I talk about inescapable problems. Your objective inescapably is to help prepare this tender young new arrival for the rigors and the joys and the beauty of human life. And that's something you cannot begin to think about how to do well unless you have a sense of what makes a life worth living and what it makes sense to aim for in life and what makes relationships and, a path through life a rewarding rather than a shallow one. And so, there's just no way to escape these questions. And while people might chafe at the word philosophy to characterize what they're doing when they grapple with them. I don't know anybody, you know, who isn't sometimes losing sleep because they're trying to figure out what's up and whether they're doing something worth doing. And, again, philosophy is just a fancy term for what we're always already doing when we're thinking carefully about what we're up to here in life. That's how I think about it.
Yeah, maybe that's what it is, where not everyone is, if let's say I'm a doctor and I say I'm a surgeon, not everybody's doing some aspect of surgery in their day to day. Like it's like a thing that surgeons do. Or if you say I'm a teacher, that's a thing that some people. I mean, I guess everyone is. Maybe that's not the best example, but there are a lot of professions. If you're a firefighter, like not everybody does that in some capacity. But I
Yeah.
think teaching as well, which in a lot of ways teaching I think is deeply philosophical, and philosophy and parenting and all these things, everyone does philosophy in that way, where everyone,
Mhm.
at the very least, everyone is thinking deeply about these questions, which is why I feel like maybe if someone feels like, oh, my life turned out quote unquote fine without having to like call myself a philosopher and like, read all these books to think deeply about it and it still turned out fine, why is it that anyone needs to? I think I was
Yeah.
actually having a conversation yesterday where I was like, but you still inherit the beliefs that someone else has done the thinking for, and then that thought ended up permeating through society. So for example, the last guest we just had on spoke a lot about sexuality and the philosophy of sexuality, and that's so fascinating to me because that's a narrative. The way we think about sex, the way we engage in sex, that's something that we've all inherited, and we haven't done the thinking through step by step necessarily, but we all inherited somebody's thoughts about those things. And so it's like
Mhm.
philosophy has deep impacts around us, but it's fascinating because it can be so quiet. You just may not know that you're inheriting the idea of another person.
Right, right. That's well put. That's beautiful, Gautam. I agree with you. And you see a similar structure, similar inheritance shaping our sense of our shared political life. These ideas of, basic rights and constitutional essentials and you know division of power within a well-ordered polity and various branches of with different responsibilities. These are ideas that were arrived at through long, painstaking thought, a great deal of it, identifiably philosophical, written down, debated about, experimented with, revised on the fly. The interaction between the thinking and the doing is essential to the sculpting of those structures and those ideas and those ideals that we inherit, and that it's our responsibility to try to preserve, make full sense of for the next generation. And so this is the work of a citizen is inescapably philosophical work, and the inheritance of of a citizen is partly a philosophical inheritance. And so I just couldn't agree with you more about that. There's always this back and forth between the politico-economic and cultural water that we swim in and reflection on how to make that environment and that experience a little richer and a little better.
Hmm. A little bit of what we've been talking about this and last season has also been about human meaning. And I want
Mhm.
to just get a little bit of your perspective on. I think meaning is just a fascinating thing. The experience of feeling like your life is meaningful, not even actually living a meaningful life, but the experience of it being like, I believe I have a meaningful life. That in itself is just so fascinating to me. And I'm curious, to what extent do you feel like the humanities, moral, ethical thinking about what it means to lead a good life, to what extent do you feel like these things play a role in living, quote unquote, a meaningful life? Or is there
Mm.
even such a thing?
Yeah, no, I do think there's such a thing. Um, you know, and uh, and I think that this is one of those inescapable questions. We're all trying to. I mean, we all hope that what we're doing is meaningful. And it's not very easy to say exactly what that hope is, to really spell it out and make sense of the idea of meaningfulness. Not at all easy. But, you characterize it as something that we believe, or at least want to believe. We want to be in a position where we can, wholeheartedly believe it. And belief is one of those attitudes that is, to believe something is to hold it to be true, right? And that's just what belief amounts to. And so we want it to be true. To want to believe it is to want it to be true. So it looks like, it's widely acknowledged that this is something that may or may not be true of us, that we are living a meaningful life. And, given that it can be true or false, it does, while the sense that you are living, the feeling that you're living a meaningful life is important, without it, you would really be at sea. Still, the fact that it's something we hope to be in a position to believe and would like to believe means that we want it to be true, right? And we recognize that the feeling might be misleading. We want to have some distance from that feeling and make sure that the feeling is tracking something real meaning or meaningfulness, right? And so, yeah, I think our concern here goes beyond, just wanting to feel that way. And it, inescapably opens up to the, the need to reflect on, or a call to reflect on whether, in fact, that feeling is warranted. Um, and that's a question that, of course, philosophers have grappled with for thousands of years, but that, really can't be definitively answered. And maybe it would be, if somebody came along and said, well, I've figured it all out for you. Here it is. There would be something suspect about that claim. And this is, I think, another difference between the hard sciences and the humanities. Whatever is of value in the humanities, including philosophy, is of value only to the extent that you reproduce the entire chain of thought that leads to it as a kind of an endpoint or revelation, right? It can't be sort of plucked off of that chain of thought and handed over to you as a little fruit of somebody else's thinking so that you can, take it over and benefit from it, right? So that's perfectly possible, say, in the study of medicine. One doctor becomes an expert in, a particular, disease, and learns that this particular medicine cures it. And all of the doctors can benefit from that learning, and all their patients can benefit from that learning without reproducing the entire inquiry that had that learning as its fruit. But if your quest is to figure out what the meaning of life is, that entire possibility of benefit from the expertise of others is out the window. It just doesn't make
Hmm.
sense, right? You can't assign to somebody else the task of figuring out the meaning of your life. Because it doesn't leave you unchanged. That the path of thought shapes you. And that it seems to me is a fundamental difference within the liberal arts between, at least some of what's happening in the hard sciences and everything that's happening in the humanities properly understood, right?
Hmm.
You know.
Yeah, it feels like the humanities approaches the unanswerable, like the
Yeah,
unquantifiable, while the hard sciences looks to understand like the quantifiable world,
yeah, yeah.
where there is just this like, and maybe one day, hopefully not, all of this can be quantified, but until then, whatever is remaining, the most like human aspects of it, fear, love, like all of that, which cannot be like so clearly explained by a hard science, seems to
Mm,
be best articulated by poetry and books and and
mm.
dance and pottery. I don't know.
Yeah, no, I resonate with that thought, and I think that a very direct indication that that's an important difference between the hard sciences and the humanities is this. You get to your first year of college, you move into your dorm, perhaps if that's your experience of higher education, and in sometime in those first few days of your first year at this new institution, you have to go over to this thing called the bookstore and get books for all your upcoming classes. You're likely to come home with or come back to your dorm room with the following: some textbooks for your hard science classes, and a bunch of often very old primary texts that for your humanities classes. Whatever's happening in the humanities can't be sort of summarized in a textbook so that the past can be discarded or left behind. You don't have to go explore it on your own and hand it over to you in this convenient form, right? The humanities aren't like that, right? They demand that we, grapple with the thoughts of others as a means of refining our own thoughts, and except insofar as we arrive through painstaking reflection at our own thoughts, whatever could be put in a book would be valueless. So I guess I don't think that it is a temporary limitation of the humanities that we haven't yet gotten all the answers and put them all in a textbook and permitted ourselves to hand them over to the next generation. It's of the essence of the humanities that the transmission will require grappling by each and every member of the next generation
Mm,
with the central questions, because you can't do somebody else's growing, deepening, self-formation.
mm.
Those are,
Dang, that's fire. Yeah, that's a great point. It's so interesting because I have this like deep hatred towards like these holistic applications for college, which have monopolized entire children's lives. Where I think the part that bothers me most is I have a few students who are extremely talented at music and I mean all the different things. But it's interesting because I feel like the way they approach those humanities is as if they were approaching a hard science where it was like, okay, if I get quote unquote good at the violin, then I can get into college. And it's no the entire part that you talked about, which is like the essence of humanities in some ways, which is this kind of exploration of the self through the medium, is completely not even relevant because your whole focus is getting good at it. And so you're just locked in kind of the technicalities of it and not focused at all on the self, all the stuff that comes out of exploring as you paint or even understanding paintings. It's just that I think has been really sad to watch where I'm like I feel like that entire aspect of learning has kind of just been ditched.
mhm. Yeah, it's awfully hard to say. The relation between means and ends, pursuing some further end and enriching yourself can be very complicated. I remember for a while I was doing yoga with some frequency. I've gotten a little too, my body doesn't like it as much as it used to. Maybe I'm a little too old for it now. Anyway, I'm not doing it as much anymore. But I remember one of my former yoga teachers saying the most interesting thing. It really caught my attention as a philosopher. In the middle of a class, she was describing the perfect pose that we were all you know doing horrible imitations of, or at least not very not perfect imitations of, even among the best students. And she, I think, wanted to express that we shouldn't be too worried about the distance between what she was describing and what we were doing. She said, "The end is the means to the end." And that was the little nugget of philosophical wisdom that I carried away from with me from that class, right? That sometimes there can be real value in aiming at an end that's separate from your activity. And I want to get good at this, but really the end is the thing that's there in the activity. I mean, the yoga version of it is something like this. What yoga is really about is not doing the perfect pose, but stilling your mind and entering into a meditative state and so on and so forth. That's the end, right? And it's right there in the activity. And it's always right there in the activity when you get absorbed in the activity. But maybe, the one who wants to become good at violin will, while aiming at that end, will find the other end, the end that, that is a means to, and get, carried away by surprise. They might be taken by surprise by the magic that's hidden in that little instrument.
Hmm. Yeah, and I guess maybe I think the biggest difference is even knowing that that can be an end. I feel like that to me, even knowing that it's possible, I think you need to hear it once to just like know that that's even a viable option. Otherwise, you only ever look at the medium as kind of this like means to an end. It can never serve as an end in itself. And I think, yeah, I mean, and that gets a painter who only paints to sell the painting, then also in the same way loses kind of, people only paint if they're quote unquote good enough. And there's just, I think the loss of creation and just like experiencing these things like dancing, like you don't need to be a good dancer to dance. You don't need
Yeah.
to be able to become a professional. You just need to move your body. And I think in that
Mhm.
sense, you have to know that that's even a possibility. Like you don't have to excel in this to enjoy it and do it and gain a lot of value and whatever, from it.
I
Do you feel like
totally.
you have a outside of philosophy, you feel like you have a hobby that kind of brings you to that state?
Well, yeah. I wouldn't call it a hobby, but
Yeah, I was gonna take that back. Yeah.
yeah. I mean, I've it's friendships and family that and time I spend with them. That is where I find the richest rewards in my life, and you know, just uh, hanging with the people I love, and um, trying to be fully present with and get absorbed in interactivities with my 10-year-old now and my grown children, especially when they were young, but when they come back and visit, and those are the richest moments in my life, and they are the kind of thing that if you're looking for some end beyond what you're up to. I mean, well, when you're raising a child, you are thinking about something beyond what you're doing. But if you're not permitting yourself to be gripped by what you're doing, then you probably never get where you're hoping you to get, right? Somehow, maybe the most important part of raising a child is, being a parent. Maybe the most important task of a parent is to stop thinking about the task of a parent and to be there with the child, right? Which is what, sometimes we all need. And so,
Mm,
yeah, I hear that. But I also think that, even if we think about the end that is a means to the end, getting good at something, you're probably not going to get very far down that road unless you are utterly gripped by the immediate value of the thing. I mean, it's hard to imagine Yo-Yo Ma becoming the cellist that he has become if it weren't his experience over and over again that he got rapturously carried away by the music he was playing. That I would, bet my bottom dollar is how he became Yo-Yo Ma and how he became revered as one who plays the cello sublimely. And, I'm sure that the same is true of any great practitioner of any really demanding human activity, from sports to, all of the arts and sciences and so on and so forth, that the the real greats, the people who really excel, are the ones
Mm,
who repeatedly and formatively open themselves to the beauty of the activity that they've come to excel in.
dang. I feel really inspired from this conversation. I just want to say thank you so much for joining. I mean, I truly, I think this is just, it's important to, I think about this and understand both sides and the complexity, even about talent and what are the ends and what does it mean to set them? What should you ought to set them to? And I really appreciate your time and your insight. Thank you.
Well, thank you for having me, and it's been a real pleasure talking to you, Gautam, and you know, much appreciated.
Yeah. Yeah. And I want to say thank you all for listening. I hope you enjoyed this conversation as much as I did. We are slowly wrapping up season 10. So I hope you enjoyed. And as per usual, stay re educated.